I remember a news report from about 10 years ago. I remember one particular detail, which was them explaining the premise and the monster of the game. It was basically a zombie game, except that the zombies were those real-life inspired fungi kind of monster that you also find in the Amazon forest or something like that. So all of it a bit vague, but I do remember that news report very vividly, which was weird because I am not a gamer. But the reason I remember that news report, the reason why I know of The Last of Us, even though I never played it and know the storyline, is partly because of the monster, because I really liked this concept of the monster. And so I was wondering, how did they come up with it and what was the process of creating this monster? Because I always like to really look at the creative process of my favorite shows, movies, books and so on, and see if I can find something in there that could be useful for me and my writing skills and incorporating it into my own skill set. So I did some research and I did find a few interviews and stuff from the creators of the original game, explaining where the premise came from, where the monster inspiration came from, and how they went about doing it. So if you're a fellow wannabe writer who is interested in learning about creating monsters for your stories, let's take a look at The Last of Us and see what we can learn from it. So the first thing that I found when it came to creating the monster was that the idea was to have a zombie monster, but what they wanted was to create a monster that was more grounded in reality and that theoretically could exist. So obviously you can debate on whether the fungi acting exactly as it does with ants in real life would work on humans, but that for me doesn't really matter in terms of, because we're obviously writing fiction. What I want to take here is this approach of looking at something from real life and adapting it so that in the story world itself it makes sense and can be used as something to create more of a grounded feeling of the monster. And because I am a bit lazy and I just recently discovered what everybody's talking about when it comes to ChatGPT, I am going to use it as help for finding real life things that match my idea of a monster. Okay, so to recap, if you don't know, I have a few videos that I talk about it already, but for this video relevant, the monster that I have is something that should be able to create some sort of silent invasion in a world. So it's a sci-fi kind of story, not an alien, but acting like an alien parasite that takes over human hosts and turns them into alien creatures. So I have 3 starting points that could be potentially interesting. So 3 things that basically are the same thing. It's some sort of parasite that either infects a mammal or an ant or an insect, or what was the other one? Or a snail. So the parasite infects that living organism, changes their behavior so that they will act more in a way that is more likely to get them eaten, and because they get eaten, then the parasite can basically complete its life cycle. So I like this as a starting point because it's sufficiently creepy and it's interesting, right? And it kind of fits with this video approach, similar to what The Last of Us did. So I like this as the starting point for taking a real life concept. I'm sure I'm not the only one who is really intrigued by the stages of the zombies. So basically that the monster has something to progress into and that you have different kinds of monsters to deal with. So it's very much plays into, because it was originally a video game, right? So that you have something to always escalate it into. I really liked that part of the monster. So that's the next thing that I want to emulate, is to figure out what different stages could the monster have to escalate into. To get started with the creation process of the progression of the monster, I also started with basically real life inspiration. So like I said, I took one of the parasite suggestions as basically my starting point. So the one that I went with is called the Toxoplasma gondii parasite. Try to say that in one sentence. And it's basically how I explained before, right? It's a parasite that gets ingested by a mammal and then starts to infect the host. And the first stage here would be the ingestion part. So this gets consumed either through food or through water. I like the idea of it being consumed through water because the world that I'm building is a multiverse and there are different worlds overlapping, and I like the idea of water getting from one world into the other and not just being plain water but other stuff being in it, because that's the hardest thing to keep out aside from air or other gases would be water, and also even if water comes in the gas form, right? And then in the real life example, what happens is basically that once it's in the system, it either spreads further into the body or it stays within the body and might not cause harm because the immune system of the host obviously keeps it in check. But basically it's only at stage 5, once the whole body has basically been completely infected, that the behavioral changes start. And the behavioral changes are where basically in rats it would reduce rats' aversions to cats or other predators, and therefore they are more likely to get eaten. So basically it sounds a bit like it would actually affect the rats' perceptions of things or kind of like inhibition to certain dangers and stuff, right? So a bit of mind control in there, which I like, which plays into the original concept that I had for my story. So, and then the final stage here would be death. But that is basically where I divert away from just the real life input, because these stages are too short-lived and there aren't too many variations in monsters, right? So next up, let's take a look at how The Last of Us does the progression and the changes in the monster. So in The Last of Us, there are 6 different types of zombies, 7 if you want to distinguish between the kinds of stalkers that are in the first game and in the second game. But basically the difference is that the more advanced you get in your gameplay, obviously the harder it is to defeat the enemy zombies. So that's why in the beginning you have the runners, which are very fast but not as hard to defeat as later on when you get to the really hard ones like the bloaters and stuff. So the whole idea there is basically that the type of zombie you encounter matches with your initial game ability and gets harder the more you progress in the game. I like the idea of taking this approach and applying it to a story as well. So it's the same thing as in other zombie stories, where in the beginning the characters are always completely outmatched because they have no idea what zombies are, right, and how to defeat them. And then later on, as they get much better at it, you have to introduce new threats into a zombie stories because it doesn't make sense anymore to just have the zombies as the threat. So here is what that looks like. I broke it down into 4 stages that I already know, and it kind of goes like this. So first stage is where the host is mind controlled. Also, do you spell mind controlled with 2 L's? I'm not sure. Probably, right? And that's basically a few days to several weeks where the host gets first infected and then starts to show different behaviors and stuff, while the parasite or whatever it is starts to nest within the body and starts to alter the host's behavior. Then the second stage is when the host disappears. So basically this is the nesting period where the host is starting to be taken over physically, not just from the inside, but actually where the physical makeup starts to change. And once that stage is over, the next stage is when the host has turned into an actual monster of some sorts. Don't know what the monster looks like exactly right now, but the idea is here that basically at this point the host has transformed enough that it is so different that it can no longer communicate with humans, and humans just see the monsters and obviously don't know what is going on. Maybe one idea here could be that it's still the person, but the person can no longer basically act human and loses more and more of who they themselves are. And then the final stage would be where the monsters are completely transformed, so the host is basically gone. It's just the physical makeup of the original body that is still there, changed into this monster shape. And these monsters start to socialize with each other, they work together, and they turn out to be very intelligent. And if you put that into a game setting to figure out what would be the challenges for the player, or in this case obviously the characters, it's basically the initial stage. Stage 1 is where you don't know what is going on, so you don't know how characters are being infected, you don't even know that they are being infected, they just behave a bit weird. And in this stage, what I want to figure out at a later point is, would it be possible for the immune system to fight off this infestation? You know, is it like just a few people are actually getting really infected, or is it everyone? Because the original inspiration of this parasite is that not every host that gets infected actually then ends up, you know, changing their behavior to the point where they get themselves killed, but rather that some of them, they get infected, but the immune system basically fends it off before it gets too bad. And with The Last of Us, obviously, because it's a game, there are very clear ways that you can defeat the monsters at each stage. So I tried to figure out something similar for myself. So what would the characters have to do at which stage to defeat the monsters? At stage 1, it's very much, basically they're still human. If you knew what is going on, you could just kill the person. Does that help in order not to get infected yourself? That's something that might need a bit more fleshing out. Then stage 2 would be basically to burn all the biological material and stop the nesting process. Stage 3 is once it's transformed, then it would be very hard to kill, because if we put it back into a game setting, that's the point where the player is experienced and knows how to kill off the earlier 2 stages, right? So this is when you demand more skill from the player in order to survive. So this is basically where killing one of those creatures should be really hard. So then when it comes to stage 4, when they actually then also turn out intelligent and working together with other creatures, it becomes a real challenge for the entirety of humanity and not just for a few people, right? Because that's the thing when you try to create a monster like this that basically brings humanity to the brink of extinction. Without space technology or like a virus that just basically turns us into something else, it's very hard to think of something that can basically defeat humanity, because we're so many and we're so intelligent and we're so mean-spirited. So that's why the monster should be an actual challenge, right? The next thing that they did in The Last of Us, which is much harder to do, especially in one sitting, so you will need some time to research it and properly develop it. But basically what they did is they used motion capture technology to emulate the movements of actors to create realistic movements from the zombies in the game. And basically what I want to do is take this and put it into a writing setting by figuring out how can I give the creature realistic features or behaviors description that make it feel more realistic and more scary because of it. I think the key to applying this correctly is to use something that creates a sense of familiarity while also being put into this strange context, right? Because if you think about it, basically the movements that the zombies have in the game is very much, it's human-like. It's very much something that seems familiar to us, but then seeing it on those creatures in that way, that's the part that then makes it almost a bit into this uncanny valley effect territory. So that's what I think can also be applied for the writing, where basically you take something that seems a bit familiar, but put it into this scary context. Something that I want to look at more closely for this is basically this idea of the humans are changing into first those creatures and then they are completely lost, right? They have become basically someone else, right? It's just not a human person anymore, but it's a new consciousness with new motivation and stuff like that. So I like the idea of having this process being somewhat realistic. The only thing that I can think of that, to be honest, I don't know much about right now, but have heard of, is where people show behavioral changes due to either brain tumors can be something, or dementia has also an effect, where basically people who have always been themselves suddenly act completely different without any real cause. And the thing that often comes up in that context, I think, before people learn that it's because of an illness, is that it's not really clear if it's because this person has changed due to something happening and no one knows it, or is it because this person has been pretending to be someone else for so long and now they suddenly change their behavior, right? It's kind of like this scary thing of not knowing, is this person acting abusive, scary, or threatening because they have always been this way and the mask has slipped, or is it because they are actually ill, right? So that's the inspiration that I kind of want to draw on a bit from, I think, when it comes to portraying the change of the people and how they start acting initially, so that there's kind of like a hint of something sinister in there. But not necessarily, what I don't want to do, because it's a silent invasion, I don't necessarily want it to go into this fairy story where it's the people start acting emotionless, you know, and they start becoming really kind of like shells of their former selves. I don't want to go in that direction. I don't want it to be, the invading species isn't something that is just driven by logic and doesn't have, you know, any emotions or stuff like that. I want to go into a complete different direction, basically, where it's the invading species is highly sociable, they're very intelligent, and the hosts, when they first start to turn, they lean more into emotional outbursts and stuff like that rather than withdraw from it, if that makes sense. How the creature affects the world and the characters, and how that plays into the characters' journey and how they develop themselves, right? Because it's very much exploring this whole setting of devastation, of those infected roaming free, of not being safe, kind of like that setting, right? So there's the question of, then once you have this monster, how does it affect your characters? What does it say about your characters and the themes that you want to explore? For myself, the theme that I want to explore is very much that of what makes us who we are. Are we capable of change, or are we just figuring out who we are the more we get into situations where basically we discover more about ourselves, we don't really change? That's kind of like the main question, I guess. And here obviously the monster kind of plays into that, because it's very much taking an existing thing and changing it completely into something else. And where does the human go, basically kind of like a bit into that. But another aspect that I find actually more interesting is this idea of, after we get to stage 4 with the monster, and now the monster is starting to socialize and really take over, humans are starting to lose territory, and they're basically, you know, it turns into kind of like a zombie apocalypse setting where there's less and less space for the humans, and the humans are more and more taken over. The next thing that I would want to get to is kind of like this stage where those creatures don't just try to eat people, they don't just try to eradicate them, they're not mindless eaters, they start to settle down and they start to create like their own settlements, kind of the places where they can keep their own young safe, stuff like that. So that's, for me, is the part of the story where it then gets to the question of, how does this affect the characters in the long term, when all of a sudden you're no longer the dominant species on your planet, and the other newer dominant species is now starting to really start living in your house, basically, and starting to decorate your house while you're still being kicked out. That's where the whole setting should go, and where the creatures really start to explore this idea of being replaced. And that's the last thing that I found from The Last of Us that I'm going to leave you with, is they very much focused on creating a sense of empathy for the creatures. So they're not just monsters to be defeated, they are very much individuals who have their own story, who got turned, who lost their lives through that, right? And they very much tried to create this sense of empathy, of giving the zombies, when you encounter them, some sort of backstory that you can kind of deduce from their situation, and through that making the whole tragedy and also the horror of the situation much more clear, which is what I mentioned before, kind of like this setting of having those creatures now starting to actually settle in and realizing that you're really starting to be replaced as humans. That's very much what I want to do here as well. So yeah, this is it, basically a bit of an impromptu video on the process of how The Last of Us created their monster and what went into it, and how that could be translated into writing. If you know more about the creation process and other techniques or lessons that we could apply, please let me know, let us know, because obviously it's very cool to see how others are doing it, how the professionals, how the masters are doing it. And also something that I'm very much interested in is different mediums for stories and how their process can be translated into the novel writing process, because there are a lot of things that you can do in games that you could apply to some extent in novels, I believe, and that could be really cool to give it like this unique feel or this additional engagement element. So yes, let me know if you have anything additional or if you have anything that you don't agree with. If I got anything wrong regarding the monsters or the zombies, definitely correct me. And other than that, if you're interested in writing and if you're also at the stage where you're trying to learn more about writing fiction, then feel free to stick around. That's very much what I'm doing around here, trying to get better at my own writing skills, trying to find as many ways of adding to the process as I can. And if you like this, let me know. Other than that, I'll see you soon.